and welcome to Chapter 32, Learning Objective 4, and we only have 2 more to go. Woohoo! Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And in this particular objective, we're going to take a look at the effect of a budget deficit, and we're going to kind of remediate this a little bit because we're going to go back to talk about that loanable funds market and what happens when we run a deficit there. Okay, so budget deficit. Okay, so suppose the government runs a deficit and was previously balanced. Use the appropriate diagrams to determine the effects on the real interest rate and net capital outflow. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about that. So remember that the supply curve, and this will be the loanable funds market, and remember that the supply curve is savings or national savings, which is made up of private savings by households plus public, and that would be the government. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and break these out. So Y, GDP minus taxes minus consumption plus taxes minus government spending. Okay, so that was back in previous chapters. We have the demand curve down here for loanable funds. And since we've opened the economy, we already know that it was domestic investment plus net capital outflow. Where these two crisscross will be the real interest rate. So we'll call that R. And this will be the quantity of loanable funds. And this is when we are not running a deficit. Okay. So now let's take a look at the problems. It says now we're going to run a government budget deficit. Remember that the budget deficit decreases national savings. And so the supply curve is going to shift inward and to the left. I'll call it S1. Our new equilibrium, where they crisscross, will be R1. And if I follow this down, this will be the quantity of loanable funds. Okay, so what essentially is happening? In this case, the real interest rate is increasing. So we would expect then that domestic money would stay home. So dollars would stay home, which means that net capital outflow should decrease. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and change pen colors and move to the second graph so you can see kind of what happens. So at a balanced budget, I'm going to follow this over. Remember, this is net capital outflow. And if I drop this down, this is where we have a balanced budget, net capital outflow. Okay. Now, let me go ahead and change up the colors again so we can follow through what happens when we start to run a budget deficit. So when we start to run a budget deficit, now I'm going to take where I found R1 and I'm going to come over here to the net capital outflow. If net capital outflow was 0 here, my new net capital outflow is going to be less than 0 or negative. And so we have dollars staying in the US. Okay, so this is the workout for it. Okay, all right, so use the appropriate diagrams, real interest rate, and net capital outflow. So we've done that. Okay, so here's our answer. And again, a deficit reduces savings, supply of loanable funds causing the interest rate to rise. So exactly what I just did a moment ago, which causes net capital outflow to decrease. We're going to have foreign money coming into the United States. Okay. And remember that the loanable funds market determines that real interest rate, then that determines the net capital outflow. So initially the government balanced its budget, net exports were 0, and then suppose that the government runs a deficit, we know that the real interest rate rises, net capital outflow falls. But how does the budget deficit affect the real exchange rate and the balance of trade? So now we're going to use all three graphs here. And again, just because I think it's important to kind of work these through and understand where things happen. Remember, this is the real interest rate. This is the quantity of loanable funds. We're going to start here to balance budget, national savings, and we have the demand, which is equal to investment plus net capital outflow. We have national savings, which is private plus public. Okay, so right now we're at interest rate R1. Here's our quantity of loanable funds, 1. We're going to go ahead and follow this over to the second graph. Okay, this is net capital outflow. We're going to go ahead and drop that down. And where we drop that down at, we're going to follow it into this graph. Okay, so right approximately here. Here we have, I hope I put this graph up here right. Well, it seemed like I did. Okay, so here we have the real exchange rate. Here we have net exports. And our supply curve here should be right here. So that's net capital outflow. Should be right there. Okay. So now let's go ahead and run a budget deficit. So now we're going to run that budget deficit. You already saw me do this part previously. So now we end up with less national savings, S1. The real interest rate increases to R2. Follow that over. Net capital outflow decreases because the dollars stay here, and then foreigners will invest in our economy. So let's see what happens. The one I'm really interested in is that downward curve. So if the real exchange rate originally was right here, because that's where it was, that was the real exchange rate. Now we're running a deficit. So what happens to the real exchange rate is it increases. So the US dollar appreciates relative to foreign currencies. What happened to net exports? Notice that here we had net exports right here originally, right? Because we're only, again, interested in this line right there. Just erase that, pretend it doesn't exist, okay? Now, so what's happening is foreign money is coming in. Because the interest rate is higher, because R increased. Now, what's happening to our net exports? Well, think about it this way, because we're appreciating, right? So US goods become more expensive relative to other goods. So what happens is when we look at this, remember net exports are exports minus imports. And it would make sense, wouldn't it? If our goods are becoming more expensive, that we would export less. So that's why we see that the exports would decrease because the real exchange rate increased, which would lead us to less net exports. Okay? Okay. All right. So just to kind of look at it. So this would be our panel, our third panel that we've been talking about throughout these objectives. So again, here's net capital outflow. I drew it incorrectly on the previous graph when I set this up, so I apologize. So supply curve is net capital outflow. The demand curve here in the foreign exchange market is net exports. Where those two crisscross, that's where we're going to start at that exchange rate, right? But we know that when the real exchange rate goes up here, the real interest rate goes up here in the US, that net capital outflow is going to shift inward and to the right. We'll call that S2, or net capital outflow 2. And that's what we have happening here is if the original was here at the exchange rate 1, that was the amount of our net exports 1. And then when we have that government running a deficit, we decrease 2 and the exchange rate goes up. So essentially what happened here is the exchange rate, the real exchange rate increased, okay? And when the real exchange rate increased, if we look at what is net exports, it's exports minus imports. Because the real exchange rate is increasing, that means our goods are becoming more expensive. So people aren't going to buy as many of them in other countries. So if originally, let's say it was 5 and 3, that was our net exports. Okay, at NX1, at NX2, or net exports 2, we're going to export less, so 4 minus 3, and that would be NX2. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay, suppose the government provides new tax incentives to encourage investment. What happens to all 3 diagrams? Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. I don't know, I can't do it there. Okay. All right, so I'm going to just live with this. So the first thing I want you to do is kind of erase this because I want to live with just the downward sloping. Okay, so again, starting in the loanable funds market, here's our real interest rate, loanable funds. Okay, and here's our national savings. Here's our investment plus net capital outflow. Here is our quantity of loanable funds. We're going to go ahead and follow that over to net capital outflow. And we see that net capital outflow comes in here. Okay, we're then going to propel that downward. And that's the part I want to look at right there. Okay, so where these two crisscross, going to be right here. Remember, this is net exports. And this is net capital outflow. We'll follow that over, and that will be our original exchange rate, real exchange rate. What happened? Net exports are going to be right here at 0. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take the problem. I'll do that in green. Okay, suppose the government provides new tax incentives. So incentives, remember, way back chapter 27, I believe, we're going to go ahead and increase the domestic investment. When we do that, we're going to shift this curve outward and to the right. Okay, and this will be I1 plus NCO. Where these two crisscross is going to be our real interest rate. We're going to go ahead and follow that over to net capital outflow. We'll call this net capital outflow 1. We're going to go ahead and drop that down. When we drop that down, we're going to come in here and drop it here. We're going to go ahead and move this in, and we'll have the real exchange rate 1. So how would this policy affect the real interest rate? Well, what happened with the real interest rate? We increased the real interest rate. What happened to net capital outflow? Net capital outflow decreased. Why? Because the US is paying a higher interest rate, so more investment is staying home, and foreigners are bringing their financial capital to the US to invest because the interest rate is higher. So a decrease in net capital outflow, it's staying home. Okay, so we showed that here and here. Okay, the third graph, what happened to the real exchange rate? The real exchange rate increased. And what happened to net exports? Because again, they're more expensive. So we have, if it was 0 here, it would be something less than 0 here. So net exports would decrease. Okay. So again, just kind of how it looks, walking it through. Demand curve shifts out, increases the real interest rate, decreases net capital outflow, which in turn increases the real exchange rate. That reduces net exports. Okay, so the government budget deficits, we talked about some of these, but let's look at it specifically for the purposes of an open economy. And remember when we, okay, so here, remember taxes minus government spending. Here, government spending is greater than taxes. So we have negative public saving. It reduces national savings, overall reduces the supply of loanable funds. It increases the interest rate, the real interest rate, right? I just want to throw that in there, which reduces net capital outflow. It crowds out domestic investment, okay? Decreases the foreign exchange. Currency appreciates, real exchange rate goes up. Net exports fall because of that. And then the push the trade balance toward a deficit. So we started with 0 and now we're in a trade deficit. Why are we in a trade deficit? Because we said net exports has to be less than 0. So it has to be negative when the government runs a budget deficit. So these are the graphs which look through the same thing again. And if you'd like, you can go ahead and revisit those.